So we're going to look at a simple story type of situation that might help you make a connection between how to multiply and divide integers. So, for example, let's pretend that you live way back, like in the 1800s in the Old West. And back then, that's when you had the sheriffs in town and you had the robbers and the bad guys. So, if you think about it, when a good guy enters your town, so let's think for a second. The good guy, that's a good thing. He's a good guy. That's positive. He comes into your town. That's positive. That's good for the town. Now, when that good guy, who's positive, leaves the town, which is negative, that's bad for the town. When a bad guy comes into your town, that's also bad for your town. But when the bad guy leaves the town, that's going to be good for the town. And what this story situation does, it gives you a context for when you're multiplying or dividing integers. That being said, it's really important that you don't just try to memorize things. So this gives you sort of a simplified context, but it's also important that you kind of understand why these things work. And we're going to look at some examples why, and I'm also going to give you a link that goes into more detail about things like, for example, why does a negative times a negative equal a positive? Why is that? So let's just look at sort of a summary of this type of situation. So for example, what that story just showed you was that two positive integers, when multiplied together or divided, two positive integers will give you a positive answer. Now this is the one that is a little bit confusing for some students. Two negative integers, when multiplied or divided, will also give you a positive. And it's when you multiply a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, that's when you end up with a negative answer. So this summary here is like a little multiplication times table chart. A positive times a positive, so think of this in terms of a multiplication times table. A positive times a positive will result in a positive. A positive times a negative will result in a negative. A negative times a positive will result in a negative, and a negative times a negative will result in a positive. Now I'm just going to add a page, and let's talk a little bit about why that is. So let's say I'm doing negative 2 times 3. What that really means is it means that the opposite of 2 times 3. That's what that means. So it means take two groups of 3 and find the opposite of that. So two groups of 3, that's 6. The opposite of that is negative 6. Okay? Now, what this one means, let's say we have 3 times negative 4, that means 3 groups of negative 4. So if you were to picture 3 groups of negative 4, so with integer chips, for example, negatives are shown with red, so there's one group of negative 4, there's 2 groups of negative 4, there's 3 groups of negative 4. What that equals is it equals negative 12. So there's two examples of when a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative results in a negative answer. So this first example, when the negative's in front, means the opposite of 2 times 3, or the opposite of 2 groups of 3. This one means 3 times negative 4 means 3 groups of negative 4. Both will give you a negative answer. Now, the one that's the easiest is a positive times a positive. You've been doing that forever. 2 times 2, that just means 2 groups of 2. So there's one group of 2, there's 2. That's just going to be 4. That's easy. You've been doing that basically since about grade 2 or grade 3, since you've been multiplying. Now, the one that's a little more challenging is this one here as an example. So what does this mean? This means the opposite. So this negative in front means the opposite of 2 groups of negative 4. So let's think about that. So what this whole thing here means is the opposite of 2 groups of negative 4. Now, what is 2 groups of negative 4? Well, there is two groups of negative 4. Two groups of negative 4 is negative 8. What's the opposite of that? So basically what I'm asking you is, what's the opposite of negative 8? And I get 8. So a negative times a negative will result in a positive. Now the interesting thing is, what if I had 3 negatives? What if I had something like negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 4? This one, quite complicated. So let's look at this first. This means the opposite of two groups of negative 3. So let's think about what's two groups of negative 3. I get negative 6. The opposite of that, so what's the opposite of negative 6? Is 6. Now, that piece became 6. So now my question is 6 times negative 4. What does that mean? Well, 6 times negative 4 means 6 groups of negative 4. That one's going to be awfully long to draw out. Should have thought ahead there, but 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups, 6 groups. I end up with negative 24. Now what's really interesting here is my original question had 3 negative signs and my answer is negative. So what's really cool is a negative times a positive. So one negative sign will result in a negative answer. 2 negative signs, so a negative times a negative, will result in a positive answer. 3 negative signs is a negative. Guess what 4 negative signs will be? Remember, math is all about patterns. 4 negative signs will actually be a positive. 5 will be negative, 6 will be positive. It keeps flipping back and forth. So if you have an odd number of signs, you will get a negative answer. But an even number of negative signs will give you a positive answer. And I will give you a link to something that goes into, again, more detail about why things like a negative times a negative is a positive. Let's just look at some examples now of what's happening. So again, a few examples. Okay, so sorry, again, a few examples. So negative 3 times 5. Again, what you want to do is just think in your head, what's 3 times 5? So really the fact that it has a negative sign doesn't impact your answer. It just possibly makes your answer negative or positive. So negative 3 times 15, that's negative 15. 5 times 6, you've been doing questions like that for a really long time. A positive times a positive will give you a positive. Negative 2 times negative 7. Again, remember that means the opposite of two groups of negative 7. So that 2 negative signs will give you a positive. 8 times negative 4. That will give you negative 32. Now division works exactly the same way. So 42 divided by negative 6, 1 negative sign, I get a negative answer. 35 divided by 7, 2 positives, I'm going to get a positive. A negative divided by a negative, I'm going to get a positive. And then 18 divided by 6, so a positive divided by a positive, again, I'm going to get a positive. So division and multiplication are exactly the same. Now again, here's a couple challenges with some things that we talked about in terms of number of signs. So when you look at this bottom one, you have 2 negative signs. So think to yourself, 2 negative signs, that means my answer will be positive. And then all I have to do in my head is figure out what's 3 times 4 times 2. So 3 times 4 times 2 is 24. 2 negative signs means it's going to be positive 24. Again, remember, I don't have to put a plus sign in front. Now this one, I have 1 negative sign. So remember, 1 negative sign means that my answer will be negative. And then all I have to do is think, what's 5 times 6 times 4? And that's going to be 120, and then I just have it just happens to be negative. This one, I have 3 negative signs. So again, 3 negative signs will result in a negative answer. And then all I have to do is what's 1 times 2 times 3? So I get 6, and I just make it negative 6. And then this last one has 4 negative signs. 4 negative signs will result in a positive answer. And then all I need to do is think what's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. I get 24, and I'll get positive 24.